Hi there, and welcome to our first chapter of our AP American Government and Politics. Now, this is the textbook that we use, okay, for my class, and we basically are going to go through each unit, looking at each chapter, laid out as it is by the AP American Government and Politics curriculum, not necessarily by the way they have the textbook set up. So, for example, Unit 1, we're going to be looking at chapters 1, 2, and 3 in our textbook. Okay. And this chapter is just that we're starting out with this chapter 1. It's just an introduction to government in America. It's real kind of basic and simple. And it talks about how, like, the more interest we have in politics, the more we pay attention to what's going on in the world, the more informed we are, the more we're willing to participate. And to be honest, Americans don't do a very good job of that. So they have a number of graphs that start us out in the chapter that looks at just how pathetic we are when it comes to American government and politics, or at least our knowledge of it. And they like to pick on the young adults in this graph here. Like, these are people, the percent of people who rarely follow politics. And as you can see, based on the year when this book was published, around 2010 or so, 2011, young adults basically really were not very active and involved in politics. President Obama got them a little bit more interested in it, but there were some times when it was as high as 70% of people who said they barely followed politics between the ages of 18 to 29-year-olds. Older Americans have a little bit more concerns and cares with politics, and say they tend to focus on it a little bit more. And since they focus on it a little bit more, they tend to have a little bit more knowledge about politics. This was asking people basically 5 simple questions about American government, and it measured what percent of those questions they got correct. As you can see, basically, the older you are, the more likely you're going to get more answers correct. And the younger you are, the less you're going to know about American government and politics. And if you know less, you're going to be less involved. You're going to be less likely to vote. So this is the percent of older people, 65 and older, who are basically voting in elections. And they tend to be somewhere around the 65 to 70% range. It's always a little higher on the election of a president year, and always a little less in that midterm election between presidential elections. That's why you get this nice little heart rate look here. As for young adults, they fluctuate a little bit more because they tend to be a little bit more involved when politics involve the presidential elections, and they tend to care very little when it doesn't involve the presidential elections, those midterm elections. And their numbers are pathetic. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. When we're talking about 20 to 25, maybe 30% voter turnout, especially in those midterm elections, it's hard to imagine a politician who's going to be overly concerned about young adults when they know that they don't really have a chance of voting them out of office. So this is American government and politics. It's 2 very separate things. We have to be very distinct about that. Politics is the idea of basically figuring out who gets what, when, and how they're going to get it. It's the process that we use basically to take everything that the government does and figure out who gets what, when, and how. Okay. And politics is way more complicated in most cases than the government aspect of it. There's way more ins and outs. There's way more black and white or even grayscale, way more things to argue and to discuss and debate. And the book loves to use abortion as one of those obvious discussions and debate issues. But if we're basically trying to figure out how do we make politics happen, how do we make a policy happen, this is the little graph they have for a policy making system. The idea is that people are supposed to come up with this. Your book is way more optimistic about this than I am. But they say, like, the people notice that there's a problem, that there's a concern with our society. Maybe we're talking about the injustice that may occur to African Americans by law enforcement community. So the people see there's a problem, they see there's a concern, they have an issue with this. And so what they need to do is they need to convince the policy makers to create new policy that will fix this problem. And they have to be connected to those policymakers. So they're going to do that by basically having some kind of linkage institution, some type of item that's going to link the people to the policymakers. In your book, they talk about these being things like the political parties, being a member of the Republican and Democratic Party. Elections themselves is a linkage institution. The media can basically find an issue, grab hold of it, and do story after story about it. Or you could basically become active in some type of interest group that has a distinct interest in what's going on in regards to that. Okay? Policy agenda, looking at those issues and basically let's see if we can't create something that's going to fix that problem or try to reduce that problem, whatever it might be. And then we got the policymaking institutions. This is the Congress. This is the courts. This is the president. These are the bureaucracies that basically work for that. We basically see these policymaking institutions create new policies, new laws, new regulations. And so we look at these new policies, these new regulations that they have, the new tax that they may impose, whatever it is that they look as a solution. They implement it. And then we have to evaluate that. Did it work? Was it effective? Did it solve the problem that we saw? If it didn't, we got to go back up to the circle and go all over again. So this is just going to kind of restate what we just got done talking about. We got the people with an interest or problem or concerns. They're going to have to get linked to those policy makers, and they do that through parties, elections, mass media, and the interest groups. They create these policy agendas. It's the issues that attracted the attention of the public officials. If enough people are concerned about it, enough of the media talks about it, and then something happens. Maybe Congress passes a law. Maybe the president creates an executive order. Maybe the judicial branch, basically the courts, look at a case that deals with this particular thing. And then we get a new policy. It's the way that government basically responds to the issue that we were talking about. And then we have to see what kind of an impact did it have? Did that policy actually affect the problem? Did it make a difference? And then we have to evaluate that. Okay. This little graph here just goes through the different types of public policies that you might see. So for example, when we talk about the Congress, we're talking about them passing a law. When we see the president, we're talking about maybe a decision he makes or an executive order. We're looking at the courts, we're talking about a Supreme Court opinion that they came up with, something that they ruled on. We're looking at like the budget, how much money you spend on one issue over another kind of tells you how valuable and important that issue is to the federal government. Or we can be talking about like the bureaucracy creating regulations, something to, kind of guide us and to try to fix the issue that we're talking about. So, how effective is democracy? How much do people agree with the statement that democracy may have its problems, but it's way better than any other form of government? When we asked people in the different countries whether or not they strongly agreed with that or agreed with it, 93% of Americans said that they strongly agreed or agreed with the statement that democracy may have problems, but it's better than any other form of government. We do see some countries that were above us on that, but we also see a lot of countries, of course, who are going to be below us in that. And a lot of that has to do with how well that democracy has worked for their country so far. So that number could fluctuate with the United States as time goes on. Let's take a look at some of the democratic theories that we have here in the United States. Democracy, of course, is the system in which policies represent in response to the public's preference. What do the people want? The will of the people. And in order to have a strong democracy, we usually think of 5 components to the traditional democratic theory. We should have equality in voting. We should have effective participation in the whole process. We should have enlightened understanding by its citizens. They should understand these issues. The citizens should be in control of the agenda, deciding what's important and what's not, what we should be focusing on. And then you should also have inclusion. You should have many people involved in it. So right here, looking at this, this is a good place for you to look at, like, how good do we do in this? How strong is the United States with these 5 different components? Do we have equality in voting in this country? Do we have effective participation? Do we have enlightened understanding? Do we have citizens who are actually in control of the agenda or some other force in controlling basically what we seem to care about? And do we have a lot of inclusion in our country? And I think right now you would be hard pressed to say that we're doing a great job with all 5 of those. We definitely have a lot of work that we could do. So this is one of these things that's going to pop up over and over and over again in AP American Government and Politics. These are the theories of American democracy. We're going to hear these theories, names over and over again, so it's a good idea to learn them right now. The first theory is the pluralist theory. It's the theory where people believe that they're very optimistic. They believe that government and policy emphasize that politics is mainly a competition among groups. You have these different groups fighting for different things, Each one is pressing for its own preferred politics. But here's the good thing. Because there's groups on each side of these issues, the groups are going to have to work on and compromise with each other. They're going to have to bargain. There's going to have to be some give and take. And then they're going to come up with a policy that's going to be fair to both sides. Even though it may not be exactly what each side wants, it's going to be fair. That's a pretty optimistic way of looking at it. So if we look at the issue of abortion, you could say, well, there's pro-choice people, there's pro-life people, there's groups for pro-choice, there's groups for pro-life. Because of that, they're going to have to work on some kind of compromise of what we're going to get. There's the elite theory, which basically says, yeah, that sounds all good and fine and stuff, but that doesn't really matter. What really matters is who's got the money. Whoever has the money may not have power, but they definitely have access to power. And so the elite theory basically states that policy is going to benefit those who have the money and those who have power. And if you're talking about like raising the minimum wage, this is the perfect example for the elite theory. A person making $7.25 an hour does not have the same kind of political push and power as the CEO of Walmart. So it may not be a fair and balanced. Hypopluralism is the theory that there are so many groups on each side of every single issue that you will never get a good bill or a good kind of compromise. There are so many goods on each side. They're confusing and contradictory. And then what we basically get is if a law gets passed at all, which is hard to do, that is going to basically be toothless. There's not going to be any real there. The politicians are too busy trying to make every single group happy. And because of that, our politicians, our Congress, our policymakers are basically weak and ineffective. To put into visuals, this is what a pluralist would think. It's fairly even and balanced. This is what elite would think. And this chaos here is what the hyperpluralist would think. Okay? Which one do you think you are? All right, so there are a lot of challenges to democracy. And we are seeing these challenges today, but we've always seen them. Number one is our issues are just becoming way more complex. It is unlikely that a regular citizen is going to be able to understand the complexities of something like healthcare, or tax reform, or a nuclear weapons ban treaty kind of thing. It's just extremely complex. We also have some other challenges, such as we have a limited participation in government right now. We have very poor voting turnout. Even in the 2020 election, which just got over with, so I'm dating this, we probably had about a 65% voter turnout in an election which was, very significant and important, like a lot of elections are, but also was extremely, heavily talked about in all corners of the country, kind of thing. And yet only 65% of the people could be bothered to go out and vote once every 4 years. We also have crazy escalating campaign costs. And this is going to keep the regular average person from running from office. This last election, we're looking at each of the candidates spending close to $1 billion, $1 billion with a B, to try to win the presidency of the United States, which pays $400,000. We also have a lot of diversity. We have a lot of different interests, and this means that we have a lot more gridlock. We have people on both sides of the aisles, and they don't always want to compromise and work with each other. Here's a great example. One of the first things that we have to do is we have to know the basics, at least, of our government. How can we get into the complexities if we can't name the very basics? So right here, this is going to only work for people in Wisconsin in their 8th district. One of these guys is your elected representative. Who is it? Okay, take a guess. If you don't know, take a guess. First of all, this dude is not even in politics. He's an actor in a little bit of trouble, right? He's in a TV show, or was in a TV show called House of Cards, a political TV show. Right here, this is the guy who represents Wisconsin District 8, okay? Most Americans can't even identify the individuals who represent them in Congress. if they can't even identify, if they couldn't pick their congressman out of a lineup, then how can we expect them to basically know where they stand on the issues? All right. The political culture in the United States. This is our overall set of values. This is what we believe to be absolutely necessary, and this is just part of our core political culture. We got liberty, which is freedom, egalitarianism, okay, individualism, laissez-faire, and populism. Let's take a look at each one of them. Liberty. This is the idea of give me liberty or give me death. Some people might even want to put it on a license plate. Freedom. Americans love freedom. We love the word freedom. We love saying freedom. We love talking about our freedom. We love to think like we're the only country or one of the few countries in the world that has this much freedom. And to be honest, that's just not the case. Most countries have freedom, lots of freedom. And freedom comes at a cost, and it also comes with restrictions. But we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through there. Egalitarianism. All men are created equal. The idea that we have not equal, we have equal opportunity, if nothing else. At least we're supposed to. Individualism. This is definitely a very American idea, that you should get ahead by what you do on your own without the help and assistance of others. This is the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing. Right? And part of this is the American West, the American frontier. Laissez-faire, French word. Laissez-faire means the idea that government should have its hands off of the economy as much as possible. And then we have populism, government of the people, for the people, by the people, as Abraham Lincoln said. So the more people who support it, it's the right of the average citizens, it's the right of the majority, the idea of populism. So in your book, towards the end, and you can tell when this book was written because it's around 2011, 2010, they talk about a culture war. Do we have one? Is there really a big divide? And many people basically in the book will talk about how, well, there's not really so much of a cultural war going on in the United States. Well, that sure seems to be false right now. I'm basically going through this in the year 2020. There seems to be a pretty significant divide in our country right now. And that has only grown within the last couple of years, for sure. Will it get better? I don't know. I'm sure that some of you who are watching this in 2021 or later will be able to put this in, your little comments down below and let me know if it's gotten better or not. Once again, I'm not an optimistic person, so I just don't see that happening. All right, that is it for chapter 1. I'll be posting chapter 2 in a little bit. Thanks.